Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I have my June 2021 wrap-up. So June did not go necessarily the way I had envisioned it would in terms of my massive TBR I had for not only my new round of my D20 TBR game or Battle of the Bookish, which was happening this month as well. But I'm actually kind of proud that I did get through quite a few books because I ended up getting kind of back into an audiobook mojo, and I may have possibly also then put myself in a slump again, but I still got through quite a few books. So I guess it's kind of a win. So in the month of June, I had technically got through 6 books, but one of them was a DNF, and I am currently in the middle of another one right now. And so I did have one DNF, but I had a page count of 786 pages physically read, 42 hours, 13 minutes, and 11 seconds of audiobooks listened to. 1 physical book was read, no ebooks, 4 audiobooks, 1 book was from my personal library, and the other 4 were borrowed. Of the 5 that I actually completed in the month, 3 of them were 5 stars and the other 2 were 4 stars. So it was actually a really successful month, including the DNF that I even had. But truthfully, I think it was because I would have preferred to read the book that I had DNF'd physically as opposed to listening to it on audio. The first one was Truly Madly Guilty by Liane Moriarty. I have become a very big fan of Liane Moriarty's writing. I really like these kind of almost housewife mystery thrillers, and this one was following essentially 2 best friends who'd grown up for years with each other, like since they were kids. Both very different women, and essentially they do this big barbecue thing, and some kind of massive life-changing event happens, which it basically causes the 2 women to start having some kind of real massive tension between the 2 of them. And the whole story is essentially going back and forth from the present time to the past when this incident happened to find out what exactly had happened that caused this big rift. And with it comes a lot of information about both of the girls' pasts and about how they view each other and each other's families and how essentially reliant they are on each other, but in a lot of ways how they kind of have some deep-seated hatred at the same time for each other. It's a very interesting read that talks about a lot of essentially adult things about love, sex, marriage, children, family, friendship. Like, it's got a lot of stuff packed into it, and I will say that there are a lot of characters that are involved in the story, but I think that they actually are pretty well distinguishable from each other because there are other characters that come into the story that are like neighbors of some of the characters that are involved in the initial incident that happens. And so like you learn about a lot of people that were involved in this entire incident, but it is a very well thought out story and is not so confusing to the fact where you don't know what's going on or you don't know who you're viewing through. It's more a matter of it's confusing in the sense that you don't know what's happened, and the whole point of reading the story is to figure out what actually happened and then putting into context a lot of the other thoughts that are happening in the more present portions. The second book I completed was Arusha and the Tree of Wishes by Roshani Chokshi. This is the 3rd book in the Pandava Quartet, which, if you don't know, is a middle grade series dedicated to the idea that there is a young girl named Arusha who is supposedly the descendant and soul reincarnation basically of the Pandava brother, which is a Hindu mythology. This entire series is based on essentially a gender-bent version of the Pandava story, with also a lot of other things involved in it. Essentially, you have several characters who are portrayals or reincarnations of the original Pandava brothers that were in Hindu mythology, except they're all sisters as opposed to brothers. Now, this one in particular, we follow Aru, her sister Minnie, her sister Brie, and they find 2 other sisters who are twins, I think, and they are basically trying to protect them and find this thing called the Tree of Wishes, which is supposed to help them with the fight against the Sleeper, who is a villain we have known since the very beginning of the series. Now, I rated this a 5 out of 5 stars. I loved this book so much. I love this series. Roshani Chokshi, when it comes to writing middle grade, is amazing. I've not read anything older from her as of yet, but from what I've read of her middle grade with this series in particular, I'm smitten with her writing. I love Aru, I love Boo, I love Minnie and Bree and the twins and Aiden. Every single character that's involved in this story I absolutely adore, and it's also from the imprint of Rick Riordan, who is the author of The Percy Jackson, The Heroes of Olympus, and The Gods of Asgard. It's from his imprint, and so this is a series that he truly loves, and I think that you see the amount of love that is put into this story based on that aspect alone, because these books are just everything you want from a middle grade, I think, and more in terms of adventure and friendship and the growth of these characters from when they're these itty bitty little things to by like now the third book, seeing them become fully fledged individuals and understanding the real complexities of the world. And with the fourth book that has just come out in April, I am kind of wanting to read that now, but I'm also wanting to wait for the last book that's supposed to come out next year. So I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm really excited though to see how the fourth book goes, because it's supposed to get pretty intense, more so than it already has, because this one kind of tore me up in some places that I don't want to mention because I don't want to cry. Next book I read was The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh. This I was pleasantly surprised by, because I had heard some mixed reviews of how this book was for a lot of people. I did have some issues with Renee Ahdieh's series Flame in the Mist and Smoke in the Sun. I felt like that duology was way off base from what I think should have been done. I really disliked Smoke in the Sun in particular, and I have read the other series of hers, The Wrath and the Dawn. I've only read the first book. I have not read The Rose and the Dagger, but when I had read The Wrath and the Dawn, I really liked it. Honestly, because of the poor taste that the Flame and the Mist duology had for me, I'm a little worried to finish The Wrath and the Dawn duology, only because I'm afraid it's going to end up just the same. The Beautiful actually was a really interesting story for me. I really liked it. I loved the setting of New Orleans. I love the idea of bringing in these kind of vampires, and you really don't know that they're vampires until pretty much like towards the end of the book, because I really appreciated the fact that there was a lot of mystery involved, a lot of deception, a lot of darkness, a lot of uncomfortable feeling surrounding around this book, which if you don't know anything about what this is, it's about a young woman who flees her home of Paris and decides to go to New Orleans to start a new life. This is like in 1800s basically, and just in order to start her new life, she joins up with basically this convent who they essentially are through a Catholic church, I believe, and she has to basically provide some kind of service. So in order to provide service, she decides to tailor this young woman, this very affluent young woman's clothing, and she kind of gets involved with this group of people who are kind of rebellious, a little bit on the debaucherous side, and she kind of starts to build this connection with a guy that she meets through this girl. And I will say this is a very, very slow burn romance. My lord, I was like chomping at the bit, because I knew the second we met this guy in the story that he was going to be the guy we were going to have this relationship with, and I appreciated the slow burn of this, because it was kind of one of those, I'm going to start calling it a Loki-like relationship, where you have a guy in a story who is this complete jerk, constantly is getting after you and like making all kinds of jokes about you, kind of similar to the character of Loki from the Marvel Universe. I just have been obsessed with Tom Hiddleston as of late, and so that's everything I compare to is Loki. But the point being, this guy is very attractive, very kind of sullen, very dark and mysterious, and I eat that shit up like nobody's business if you can't tell. But this guy is just all kinds of adorable and attractive, and the main character doesn't really know what to feel about him, but the more that she kind of goes through and learns about him and learns about this group he's involved with, obviously she starts to fall for him. But there's also the possibility she's falling for somebody else as well, or there's some kind of unrequited love that's involved in the story with another character, which I also really liked. I really appreciated that, because it kind of created a whole new complexity of the story that really, I think, edged out this character a little bit more. Now, the one thing I will say is it is is kind of forgettable in some ways. I mean, I can't even remember the main character's name, let alone many of the details of what exactly happened. So I think that because of that, I would have to probably reread this before I even get to The Damned anytime soon, because like I remember some aspects about the main character in terms of her history and what exactly had happened to her, but as far as the events of The Beautiful itself, I don't remember much other than there's a bunch of girls that are getting killed left and right and we don't know who it is. I ended up giving this like a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book though that I completed was another 5-star, which was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I loved this book so much. Elizabeth Acevedo has once again proven to me that she is an auto-buy author for me, because I loved The Poet X, I loved With the Fire on High, and I loved Clap When You Land. Clap When You Land is a young adult contemporary story that follows 2 girls who are actually sisters, but they don't know that they're sisters, because their father essentially had lived a bit of a double life, where he had one daughter who was essentially in the Dominican Republic, and he had one daughter who was in New York City. And they have never met, they never know about each other at all until their father unfortunately dies in a plane crash. And this is reminiscent of a certain plane crash that had happened several years ago. I don't remember the name, but it was a very particular crash that had happened that was from a plane from New York going toward the Dominican Republic, and it was a very tragic event. There were a lot of people that died. I don't believe there were any survivors actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And this story is kind of supposed to be a story of a family, of 2 families who start to come together through this unfortunate event, and it brings up a lot of nasty backstory in terms of the father and what he'd done and why things were, you know, the way they were for both of these girls. And it's honestly very heart-wrenching, but it has a kind of very hopeful story too, because when you start to see these girls come together and they start to talk about their lives individually and with each other, you start to see them kind of come together in a way that I think is absolutely magical and is not something that is done very well by a lot of other people. And one other thing with Elizabeth Acevedo is she tends to write in verse, and I love when authors write in verse. I don't know what it is, but every time I read a book in verse, I love it so much more, because it's so different. It is so beautifully written, and specifically Elizabeth Acevedo, I just feel like is really good at what she does, which is writing. And she's a beautiful poet. I just, pretty much anything this woman ever puts out in the world, I'm probably gonna love no matter what. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I'm just gonna love it. The next book that I DNF'd actually was Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. Now, like I said earlier, I think this was more so a case of I probably would have preferred the physical copy as opposed to the audiobook, because I thought this was gonna basically be a retelling of the story of these 3 women that basically were recruited by NASA, these 3 black women specifically that were recruited in the 60s for the space race for NASA. And I thought this was going to basically be a fictionalized retelling of that. This was more so actually a nonfiction work that was literally telling the story from the governmental standpoint, from the women themselves and what they were doing with their lives to where they got to this point. Some of the racist ramifications that were involved, because this was also during the time of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and so there was a lot that was kind of brought into this. And I think that the audiobook made me feel very disjointed. I felt very confused as to what exactly was the point of the story, and it really wasn't even so much a story as somebody actually just going through and looking at all of the aspects of this time period, and when these 3 women were brought onto the team, what was kind of going on in the world at that time, as well as talking about what exactly they were doing with NASA at this time, and then how that changed the course of black women in the workforce, and specifically in the fields of mathematics and science and everything to do with STEM. So I felt like though I just would have gained so much more from it if I read it physically, so I do think I will eventually get back to this one if I have a physical copy of it, because the audiobook just was not giving me anything other than basically putting me to sleep. Then the last book I completed was my other 4-star book for this month, which was The Dark Tower, The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. This is the 2nd book in the Dark Tower series, and I have an entire reading vlog review for this for you guys to check out to get my in-depth thoughts on this, but basically a really interesting second installment. I really enjoyed it. I feel like I got a lot more out of this one than I think I did out of The Gunslinger, which was the first book, and it made me very excited to see what is to come for the rest of this series. But, you know, it wasn't completely rainbows and daisies. There were some issues I had, but you'll have to go watch that video to kind of get some of my more in-depth thoughts on it if you would like to see it. So those are all the books that I had read in this month. I am actually pretty, like I said, impressed because everything was a 4 or a 5 star apart from my one DNF. That really wasn't a DNF for anything other than I just needed a different version to read Hidden Figures as opposed to listening to the audiobook because it was honestly very boring. But I am really excited to see how July goes because if you have not seen my July TBR, I will also leave that for you. My July TBR is a lot more manageable than my June one was, and I have a lot of good books on there that I'm very excited to read. And the book that I'm currently reading right now is Realm Breaker by Victoria Aveyard. This was one of my books I had planned for my D20 TBR. I'm currently over halfway through this book, and I do plan on finishing it in the first part of July before I get to most of my D20 game TBR, but I like this so far. It's not as nice as I would have liked it to be, I will say, so I'm guessing it's going to be somewhere between a 3 and a 4 star, but I still have a lot of this book to go before I get a finalized answer on what my thoughts are on it. It's just not going exactly how I expected it to be, and I don't know how I feel about that, but this will be completed first before any of my June stuff, so keep an eye out for that with my wrap-up as well. But thank you all so much for joining me today. If you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys!